Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you guys today to our webinar on the new hazardous material regulations. My name's Sandy Marone. I'm the Senior Client Manager for Pinchin. I probably know many of you in the room. I did take a quick look at the registration list, so I'd like to welcome you all. We have a very full classroom today. It's, you know, in these day and age, I miss seeing you guys in person in the banquet rooms and in our classrooms. So this will have to do. We're all webinar out, but we do have very, very important information to share with you today. So I'd like to thank you for joining us. So we're going to be going, we've had a lot of requests from you guys reaching out, asking us, can you please kind of walk us through these new updates for the Manitoba Asbestos Management? And you're right, it is confusing. There was, some subtle changes, but they are really going to be impacting how you're managing your jobs, making sure you're not getting stop work orders and things like that. So all of you in the room, I know that you know who Ed Wooster is. Edwin Wooster has been with Pinchin for 30 years. He really is the hazardous material guru for Manitoba. If he hasn't seen it, nobody has seen it. So, I love working with Ed. I keep him on track. You can't get him talking about hunting or trapping or fishing or anything. So just be careful, or gardening. We'll go off on a tangent sometimes. But in saying that, he really does have the most up-to-date information, and he's here to share that with us today, just to kind of give us some really tangible things to keep in mind to make sure your projects go well. So in saying that, Ed, I'd like to hand it off to you. You're on mute, Ed.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for everybody for taking the time to join us today. This is it's a little bit overdue in getting to you. The guidelines were updated in November 2020, but they weren't released as far as we're aware of until the new year. But a lot of the changes in the guideline were very, very subtle, and they were not easy to find. So that being said, this is going to be just a summary of the changes that we were able to find. Don't consider this 100% all-inclusive, because the original guideline was published in 2016, and then it was re-released as a revised or updated version in 2017. And in the last 4 years, I can't count how many times I've gone through the last guideline, and I still find stuff that I hadn't realized or had missed all the countless other times I've gone through the guidelines. So this is as thorough of a assessment of the guideline changes as I could possibly do in the short period of time, but don't guarantee it as being 100% all-inclusive, because I literally had to go through the guideline, have the old version and the newest version side by side, and go through them line by line to find the changes. Some of them were that subtle. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over a little bit of an introduction on asbestos. This is going to be a lot of review for most of you. We're going to briefly talk about the regulatory information, and then we're going to go over what the actual changes were to the guideline. I'm going to apologize. This is not a really fancy presentation. There's not a lot of nice photos or anything you can really do when you're talking about regulations and guidelines, and this is going to be very wordy. So bear with me. I'm going to try to make this as exciting as possible, but that's a challenge. So, for the introduction, asbestos is a naturally occurring form of fibrous silicate minerals. They would mine the ore, mill it for the fibers, and then they use it for a lot of different reasons. It was heat resistant and fireproof, great electrical insulator. It was flexible and strong. It was resistant to water and many chemicals, and it altered the viscosity of liquids and slurries. So they added it to a lot of different products like plasters, asphalts, drywall joint compound, to make them easier to work with. There were over 3,000 manufactured products that we're aware of that have been made with asbestos, and 70% by tonnage were construction materials. So literally there's very few buildings anywhere that don't have asbestos in it in some form or another. The earliest documented use that I'm aware of was they found it near a lake in Finland. They did analysis of the pots and other cooking utensils, and they carbon dated back to 2400 BC. Pliny the Roman elder and Greek writer Strabo in the 1st century noted that slaves weaving asbestos into fibers would contract lung ailments. So that means that, you know, well over 2,000 years ago, the Greek and the Romans were documenting the use of asbestos fibers. In 1874, North America's first commercial asbestos mine opened in Quebec, and that was the birth of the asbestos industry. It was widely used in building construction for over a century. The hazards of asbestos in buildings are now well known, and every province has enacted regulations or enforceable guidelines related to asbestos in buildings. These regulations are going to vary between provinces. Federally, the Labor Canada and Health Canada follow the provincial standards, as well as they have their own regulations. And the federal requirements, some of the components are more strict than the provincial, and in other cases, the provincial requirements are more stringent. So when you're looking at federal sites, you have to look at both the federal and the provincial requirements, and whichever is more stringent on a federal job site is the procedure that gets followed. So the federal sites can sometimes be a little bit more challenging to navigate. Provincial regulations and guidelines are generally similar and require an asbestos management program for routine building use and define specific precautions for workers who may disturb asbestos during maintenance, renovation, or demolition. And that applies whether it's a federal or provincial site right across the country. So some of the key dates: in 1890, mechanical insulation in the form of parging cement started to be used with asbestos in it. In the 1920s, they started using prefabricated mechanical insulation sections. Approval to use asbestos in fireproofing insulation applied on structures, and asbestos use grew markedly in the 50s. In the 1970s, we already started to see the beginning of the end. There was widespread concern over asbestos in buildings and construction, and the US EPA started to take action. Ontario established the Royal Commission. In 1973, there was a ban on applying sprayed asbestos containing products in the US, and production stopped in Canada. In 1983, we had the end of asbestos use in friable materials, and fewer non-friable products were beginning to be seen in construction sites. In 1980, moderate use of asbestos in non-friable materials was still being used. 2013 declined market due to forces. Some ended completely. Formal bans lagged the market reality. So in reality, they stopped using it before any of the regulators actually started to put bans in, and that was motivated by lawsuits. In 2018, the federal government banned the import of asbestos-containing materials into Canada. Up until then, the federal regulations on manufacturing said that if it was a manufactured non-friable material, it was being manufactured to go into another manufactured piece of equipment, there was no legal requirement to disclose that there was asbestos in that product. So although a lot of people believed you could not buy asbestos anymore, that it had been banned, the reality was if you were buying brake pads, clutch plates, gaskets, there was a high likelihood that there was asbestos in those materials. And there was no legal requirement to even disclose the presence of asbestos in those products. We've seen windows that had date stamps on the glass that said they were manufactured in 2010, where the butyl tape inside the window frame around the pane of glass tested positive for chrysotile asbestos. So those are just examples of where we've seen asbestos right up into the late 2000s without people even being aware that there was suspect materials present in those situations. Some of the historical applications, I always throw these slides in because, you know, it's kind of interesting to see some of the applications. The firefighting photo, the umbrella was woven out of asbestos. John Mansville was doing roofing for both residential and commercial, as well as siding that was made from asbestos. One ad I saw from John Mansville actually was using fear of fire to sell their product, because the comment in the poster was, when your neighbor's house burns, be protected. In other words, the asbestos siding would protect your house if your neighbor's house caught fire. Nothing like fear to sell a product. One of my favorites, I always throw it in, is the Kent cigarettes. In the 1950s, their filters contained crucidolite asbestos, which was one of the most dangerous forms of asbestos there was. And The Wizard of Oz and Bing Crosby's White Christmas, when it was snowing on the sets, they were actually blowing Christ-tile asbestos onto the set. So that's the introduction on asbestos. Now we're going to start talking about the basic regulatory information. So in Manitoba, the regulation framework is the Workplace Safety and Health Act, W210. And under that act, we have MR 217, 2006. And this is the Workplace Safety and Health Regulation. And this came into effect February 1st, 2007. This regulation has undergone, minor revisions over the years. Some of the more recent revisions were the revisions to the confined space regulations, part 15, a couple of years ago. Under the regulation, part 36 and 37 applies to asbestos. But under that, we have the Guide for Asbestos Management, which was dated June 2016. It was revised in June of 2017, and the latest revision is dated November 2020. So what changed? Most of the changes were very, very subtle. So this is a summary of the most significant revisions made. This is only a summary of newer significant changes to the existing guidelines. So you really need to go to the Safe Work Manitoba website. If you type in asbestos into the search bar, they'll bring up all the references to asbestos, and the guideline is located there. That will always be your most current version of the guideline. They may not ever put out a publication or provide a lot of notification when they make revisions. So we've been advised that it's always important to regularly check for the most recent version, and make sure you're aware of any changes that have been made to it. Unlike some of the other guidelines, like if you hunt or you fish, and the new guidelines come out when you buy your hunting or fishing license every year, you'll often find that the changes are highlighted in blue in the fishing guide or the hunting guide to flag up any new or updated changes. They didn't do that with this guideline. So you really do have to go through the guideline on a line-by-line basis to find the revisions or the changes. So when you open the guideline on the website, right on the very first pages, it has the date that the guideline was published. So you always want to make sure that you're looking at the one with the most current date on it. So a lot of these subtle changes may be difficult to identify without doing a line-by-line comparison, as I mentioned earlier. The changes range from simple formatting and grammar edits to more significant changes related to regulatory references, testing and abatement procedures, as well as references to competency of workers performing tasks such as risk assessments and sampling. So the first notable change that I identified when I went through and did the assessment was on page 7. This was a new reference to regulations, and the comment was, all key components cited above should be undertaken with guidance from a competent person. In addition, the employer and owner must ensure control measures are in place to prevent the release of ACMs before proceeding with asbestos work as per Part 37.8 1 of MR 217/2006. So this is another case of putting a lot of emphasis on the competency of the people doing the assessments and making sure that the work is being done safely. On page 8, a paragraph has been added explaining the concerns and challenges commonly encountered when sampling vermiculite. Vermiculite being that it's mica that is mined and sent to an exfoliation plant where they would heat it up and the moisture it's trapped in the stone would expand and cause the mica to pop and explode like popcorn. The asbestos is not present in the mica itself, but was present as veins of actinolite and tremolite asbestos in the ore deposits. And because of that, the asbestos is found in the fine dust that's mixed in with the larger granular materials. This means that the asbestos is dispersed inconsistently in the vermiculite, that it's often hard to identify when sampling, and you can actually get false negatives with sampling. So there was an emphasis put on assuming that the vermiculite is asbestos containing, and it flags up these concerns and issues of trying to identify the asbestos in that material. Because they processed the vermiculite from the Libby mine here in Winnipeg, we find the vast majority of the vermiculite that we sample here is Libby asbestos form vermiculite. So the statement was vermiculite containing asbestos. Insulation material that visually appears to be vermiculite is assumed to be asbestos containing due to the high likelihood of contamination with asbestos. It stated that detection of the asbestos contamination is challenging, and even the competent person runs the risk of reporting a false negative. Note that any asbestos fibers, sometimes denoted as a trace amount, small amount, few fibers observed in a vermiculite sample will confirm it is asbestos containing material. The competent person collecting bulk samples for analysis should know to ensure the selected accredited laboratory reports trace amounts. So this is a key component, and they're basically saying it's very, very difficult to identify it conclusively if the samples are not collected properly or if the lab doesn't do a thorough and detailed analysis. So it's very important to understand that. On page 9, they added for suspect asbestos containing materials. The regulation is different definitions of what is classified as an asbestos containing material based on its friability. So some products like plaster and stucco are non-friable when in good condition, but when deteriorate or during renovation and demolition, they may become friable. The definitions for these materials in the regulation are a friable material that contains 0.1% asbestos or greater, a non-friable material where asbestos is identified at 1% or greater, or vermiculite if it contains asbestos. Now, what they added to the guideline was the following paragraph has been added to address this by referencing Part 36 of the regulation, calling for a risk assessment when asbestos is detected in a material in quantities below the defined threshold. It states, wherever building materials are suspect to contain asbestos or ACMs, They must be managed and handled as if they contain asbestos until analytical laboratory testing confirms that they are asbestos-free. Materials that are not asbestos-free are found to have asbestos content below the threshold to be defined as ACM, remain subject to Part 36, requiring an assessment of risk and appropriate control measures as non-friable materials that have or may become friable over time should be considered friable when considering risk and choosing appropriate control measures. Now, this is a hot button when we're looking at assessing renovation projects, because in the past, if it was below the defined criteria, it was not treated as an asbestos containing material. Now what they're saying is, if it's below the regulated amount, flip back 2 slides. So if it's below this criteria and you're doing a renovation project, you no longer can say without a doubt it's not an asbestos containing material. What they're saying is you have to do a risk assessment on what you're doing and base your procedures on that risk assessment. So we recently saw a project where I was talking to a contractor a couple of weeks ago where they had stucco on the exterior of a building that was being removed on a demolition project that was less than 0.1% chrysotile asbestos in the stucco. And they got hit with a stop work order on the project because they had not completed a risk assessment before proceeding with the work. If you do an assessment on that material, if it's less than 0.1% in the stucco, the silica in the stucco is actually going to exceed the occupational exposure limit for silica long before you ever exceed the occupational exposure limit for asbestos. So if you're implementing dust control procedures to control the silica, you will have met the need for the asbestos fibers in that particular material during the demolition outdoors, and your workers are going to be safe from an asbestos standpoint. From a disposal criteria, less than 0.1%, you're below the regulated requirement for packaging and disposal of asbestos. The problem wasn't that they weren't following asbestos precautions. The problem was they had failed to do a risk assessment to determine whether or not the procedures they were following were adequate for the work that was being undertaken. We just got sample results from another project where they'd previously assessed plaster in the building, and they had one sample that came back 1 to 5% chrysotile asbestos in plaster. The building was being renovated. They had us come in and do a pre-renovation assessment of a small area. 3 additional samples were collected of the plaster in the room that they were being renovated. All 3 samples came back less than 0.1% asbestos. What that means is all plaster has to be treated as asbestos if you do the thorough risk assessment, because it confirmed that asbestos was present in the plaster throughout the renovation area as well as other areas, and that it was applied inconsistently. So based on that, there's a high likelihood that if you collected additional samples, you could exceed that 0.1%. And so for all intents and purposes, that material needed to be treated as a high-risk abatement in order to comply with the regulations. So it's not just a matter of saying it's below the regulated criteria so we can ignore it anymore. You have to do a risk assessment, and that assessment has to be done by somebody who's competent to evaluate what the potential risk is and develop the appropriate procedures or recommendations for the work that needs to be done. Basically complicates things a lot for building owners. Bulk sample collection on page 14. The item for sampling frequency table has been updated to address previous editing error. So when you look at the 2020 version, if you go down to item number 4 in this table, it said miscellaneous material. It had previously said in the 2020 line, the version, less than 2 linear meters or 0.5 square meters had accidentally been pasted into the bottom corridor. This has been corrected now to read miscellaneous materials. So that was an editing error previously. The following sentence has been added on page 14 as well under the table. It states, each distinct material is sampled individually based on the evaluation of homogeneity made by the competent person. Additional sampling may be required to delineate materials with unclear homogeneity. Excuse me. What this means is the definition of a homogeneous material is visually identical, installed in the same era or time frame. So when we're looking at assessing an area, the person doing the assessment needs to be competent enough that when they're collecting samples, they understand that not only do the materials have to be visually similar or identical in appearance, they also have to be installed at the same time frame. And just because you believe the area was renovated all at one time or built all at one time, you can't rely on the era of construction alone to determine whether or not a material is homogeneous. You have to look at the visual appearance of the material. And so I'm always, when I'm talking to my staff, sending them out to an assessment, I'm always reminding them, you have to understand, try to get a feel of when the area was built. Has it been renovated? Is that information available to you? If you believe everything was built at the same time, don't just rely on that data. When you're collecting samples of something like drywall joint compound, you collect one sample. You collect the same sample or a similar sample of the same material. Take both samples and compare the bags side by side. Are they the same consistency? Are they the same color? If there's discrepancies in the appearance or texture or consistency of the material, it's possible that it was a patch or that a renovation was done and it's a different material. When we're looking at plaster samples, when we look at the analysis, we have to look at the lab's description of what that material looked like under the microscope. Was there a difference in consistency in the materials that were identified in that sample? Were the colors different? Were the textures different? If we've got a positive result in one sample and a negative result in the other sample, and it was the same sample batch for a similar material, when you look at the lab's description of what they saw under the microscope, was there a difference in appearance between those materials? Because if it was, they may not be homogeneous materials, and additional sampling may be necessary to rule out or determine where the asbestos starts and where it ends. And if it can't be determined through delineation, then you have to assume it all is asbestos if one of those materials tested positive. So that's what they're trying to get across here with this information. On page 15, the explanation of sample analysis options under paragraph D has been expanded, and it reads, many laboratories will perform analytical variations of the EPA method cited above to address challenges with certain types of materials, such as the Chatfield method for floor tiles or the Cincinnati method for vermiculite attic insulation. So what that does is it expands the options for doing analysis to provide the laboratories better options to more clearly identify whether or not there's asbestos in the material. On page 20, the following line item, along with the form that was referenced, has been deleted. So the previous version said a sample form 1 for recording results of periodic inspections is included in the back of the guideline. So the former guideline had a sample form for doing reassessments, for updating your inventories, and they've deleted that from the guideline. Page 31, when they talk about perimeter air sampling during work, the bullet point on high risk type 3 work has been edited to say regular air sampling monitoring as determined by a risk assessment conducted by a competent person should be performed for asbestos fiber concentrations outside the perimeter of an enclosed work area during asbestos work and cleanup. The asbestos fiber concentrations should be as close as possible to zero and not exceed background levels. Instead of the previous intermittent air sampling for asbestos fiber concentrations outside the perimeter of an enclosed work area during asbestos work and cleanup. The asbestos fiber concentration should be as close as possible to zero and not exceed background levels. So what they're saying is, instead of randomly doing intermittent sampling, they're stressing the importance of doing it regularly, as well as putting an emphasis on the need for this to be done by a competent person. There's a lot of emphasis being put on competency in these revised guidelines. They don't want people just randomly, oh, okay, well, you know, we'll just assign this to the safety officer, just throw one more task onto their already busy schedule. You know, they haven't had any formal training on the topic, but they're safety officers, so they should know what they're doing. You know, they want to make sure that people that are doing the assessments, that are collecting the samples, have a thorough understanding of the hows, the whys, on understanding the risk assessments, not only how to set up a pump, but how to select the right location to set it up, how to set it up correctly. Those sort of things is what the stress is on. On page 20, where they talked about periodic inspections, the following line item, along with the form that referenced, went back, skipped the slide or something. So on page 31, the bullet point on high risk type 3 work has been edited to say regular. Okay, this is the slide I just went. For some reason, it skipped slides. I apologize. On page 31, the following bullet point on perimeter air monitoring, moderate risk abatement was deleted. For moderate risk type 2 work, when work is done inside an enclosed containment, enclosure, or glove bag, well, one, you don't do air monitoring inside a glove bag. Intermittent sampling just outside the area should be as close as possible to zero and not exceed background levels. Final air clearance sampling after work on page 31. A final air clearance post type 2 abatement work, including glove bag, is a measure of best practice prior to dismantling an enclosure. Was added. The following sentence was also deleted. In some circumstances, an assessment of risk may determine that a final air clearance be conducted following type 2 asbestos work before dismantling. These two edits put an emphasis on the need for a clearance versus it just being an option. So there's a stronger emphasis being put in the new guidelines to do more air monitoring more consistently. On page 34, they deleted the paragraph removing or repairing an area of drywall smaller than 1 square meter when the drywall joint compound contains asbestos can be carried out as type 1 work in accordance with a risk assessment if task-specific work procedures are developed by the employer. This means that drywall with asbestos joint compound is no longer being removed following low risk or type 1 procedures, regardless of the quantity. It is now a minimum of moderate risk work at the bare minimum, and potentially high risk if you're doing more than 3 hours worth of abatement. Air monitoring for glove bag on page 45, the first line stating intermittent area sampling in the area of work should be carried out during glove bag activities has been changed to regular area sampling in the area of work as determined by a risk assessment carried out by a competent person should be conducted during the glove bag work activities. So there is now a much stronger emphasis being put on air monitoring during glove bag work. On page 45, the previous version of the guideline stated that monitoring could be carried out for long-term projects where glove bag activities occur over a period of time for ongoing or intermittent maintenance activities where the same workers and procedures are used each time. In either of these cases, monitoring should be carried out occasionally to demonstrate that fibers are controlled when the work is done, but not necessarily each time a glove bag operation is performed. This has been replaced with a paragraph that states, monitoring should be carried out for long-term projects where glove bag activities occur over a period of time for ongoing or intermittent maintenance activities where the same workers and procedures are used each time. In either of these cases, monitoring as determined by a risk assessment carried out by a competent person should be carried out to demonstrate that fibers are controlled when work is done, but not necessarily each time glove bag operation is performed. So again, this places a stronger emphasis on the need for air monitoring. It's important to note the emphasis is put on the monitoring should be done. Emphasis is being put on the need for a competent person doing a risk assessment. And there is also a reference in there to the work being done by the same people following the exact same procedures each time. Glove bag work is probably the least reliable of all the types of asbestos abatement I've ever encountered. In my early days when I did a lot of inspection and air monitoring, I put in a lot more overtime responding to workplace exposures due to elevated fiber counts during air monitoring for glove bag work than I ever did on any high-risk abatement sites. And the reason being, the glove bag is your containment. And the effectiveness of that glove bag is solely on the procedures being followed by the worker doing those procedures. They start taking shortcuts. They start not following procedures properly. They make mistakes, or if the mechanical installation happens to be extremely damaged, or there's debris on the floor that they're working in. These all result in elevated airborne fibers within the work area. So part of the risk assessment done by the competent person is evaluating the condition of the material, evaluating that the procedures are being followed properly, that they're using proper dust control procedures, and that they are constantly following the same procedures. If those procedures aren't being followed to the T, or there's a lot of inconsistencies, you may need to do more air monitoring. But there's a stronger and stronger emphasis of doing more air monitoring, doing it more consistently on a regular basis throughout the document we're finding. And the understanding is, if you're just glove bagging one elbow here because it's damaged, or we've got an emergency response we've got to deal with, and it's got to be dealt with now, and it's on a weekend and we can't get a hold of anybody to do air monitoring, it may not be necessary to do it that day, as long as the people doing it are well versed in what they're doing it, they do it on a regular basis, and they're following all of the proper procedures. But the emphasis again is on the evaluation, the risk assessment being done by a competent person. On page 45, the defined work activities have been revised to read: removing, encapsulating, or enclosing 1 square meter in size or greater of friable asbestos during the repair, alteration, maintenance, demolition, or dismantling of a structure, machine, tool, or equipment, or part of it, or removing, encapsulating, or enclosing areas of 1 square meter in size or smaller of friable material during the repair, alteration, or dismantling of a building, structure, machine, tool, or equipment, or part of it, but where the job takes longer than 3 hours to complete. So what they're saying is, if it's less than 1 square meter, but it's going to take more than 3 hours, it's a high risk. If it's more than 1 square meter and you can do it less than 3 hours, it's still high risk when it comes to friable materials. Both size and time limits apply to what work can be completed following type 2 moderate risk. And if you can't meet those criteria, it automatically becomes a high risk. On page 55, the sampling procedures for vermiculite now reference section 1.3 of the guideline, which is the area where that sampling table was that was modified at the beginning of our presentation, instead of Appendix D. And Appendix D has been completely deleted from the guideline. What Appendix D was, a whole page dedicated to sampling vermiculite, and the problem with Appendix D was it called for 3 4-liter samples of vermiculite to be collected for the analysis. Well, in some cases, collecting 12 liters of vermiculite was completely abating the area. That's a fairly significant disturbance, collecting 4 liters of vermiculite for the purpose of collecting a bulk sample. So they reckon, and that had come from a previous resource on what some organization somewhere had recommended as a necessary amount to do an analysis. And they've deleted it because it's come to realization that that's an awful lot of vermiculite. That's a fairly significant amount of disturbance when you're collecting the samples, and then it leaves the lab with an excessive amount of vermiculite to try to dispose of afterwards. So the reference is now to collect an adequate amount of sample material that the lab is comfortable analyzing. Our lab suggests about a cupful of vermiculite if you are going to sample it, and make sure you get the fine dust in the sample when you're collecting it. So those are the significant changes to the guidelines. I know it's kind of hard to stay focused when you are going through something as wordy and challenging as this. So understanding that this is a challenge, we're going to open this up for questions for anybody that does have questions. And we do have a 5-page cheat sheet that we can send to you if you're interested, summarizing these changes.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ed. So I recognize that was a lot of information to cover, and I have about 10 questions for you here, Ed, that I'm going to kind of go through with you because we've had a lot of really good questions coming in throughout the presentation. And last,
Awesome.
if you're looking to share this presentation, this will be posted. We're not going to be sharing these slides because you can miss a lot of context if you don't see the presentation. So this presentation in its entirety with Ed speaking and everything will be posted on the Pinchin website probably in a couple of days. We've now gotten into the practice now of posting all of our webinars after, just because you can miss a lot of context if you only see the slides. So I'm just going to go through the questions here and keep them coming in, guys, into the Q&A box if you have more. So first one, how much roofing material is still asbestos?
Pardon me?
How much roofing material, you were talking about roofing asbestos being in roofing materials.
If it's older than the 90s, you should be sampling it.
Okay.
And you need to be careful because sometimes people think they've had a roof replacement and all they've done is replace the skin on the surface.
So the roof might be older than you think. It might just be.
Absolutely.
Okay. Regarding drywall compound, does this mean that simple tasks such as hanging a picture frame are considered moderate risk?
The guy, if that's a loaded question because I mean, the guideline refers to the repair, encapsulation, removal of an asbestos containing material. Everything is always based on a risk assessment. So what you have to do is you have to evaluate, what are you doing? Are you putting a finishing nail into the drywall where there's a stud? You can put a finishing nail through a painted sheet of drywall without really causing any significant disturbance. So that's perfectly fine. Are you drilling a hole in the wall and putting a mount through the wall? Well, then you're going to have to evaluate, are you using a HEPA filter tool? Or what are you doing? And you're going to have to follow appropriate precautions for making a penetration if you have to drill a hole or how much of a disturbance. But there's no black and white, well, everything is type 2 or it's type 3 when it comes to something that simple. You have to evaluate what's the likelihood of there being an exposure off of it.
Okay, good question then. Sounds like it can vary. Ed, is there a definition of bulk sample size and quantity in the Manitoba regs?
The regulations do not provide any guidance on what you do for sampling. It's important to understand the Guide for Asbestos Management is not a regulation. It is a guidance document. It's a guideline. The regulations state very specific things. The regulations state you have to have an assessment done. The regulations state that if you've identified asbestos in your building, you have to do annual updates. The regulations state if you've got asbestos in your building, you have to have a management plan in place and you have to implement it. You have to provide training to your workers, and the training has to be done by a competent person. And the guidelines leave it at that, or the regulations, leave it at that. The guidelines, on the other hand, go into more depth and they provide guidance to the layman to help them understand what they need to do to comply with the regulations. So the guidelines have a whole section on there on assessing your building. They have a section on training, they have a section on sampling frequencies. These are guidelines which are considered a measure of best practice. So they're not black and white written in stone. The requirement under Part 36 says if you're dealing with a hazardous material, you have to do a risk assessment and you have to implement procedures. And this goes back to the comment about putting a nail in the drywall. You have to determine what the potential risk is. The regulations say that has to be done by somebody who's competent. That could be your own personnel. It doesn't have to be an outside consultant, but it has to be somebody that's knowledgeable on what's being done through education, knowledge, and experience. When it comes to sample collection size, the guidelines do not tell you what the sample size needs to be. What the reference is or what they advise, what's always advised is reach out to the lab, or if you're not sure, reach out to the lab that's doing the analysis. The lab can tell you what they need to do a good solid analysis. If they do not have enough material to analyze, then they are not going to be able to report it down to a low enough quantitation limit. So for a friable material, they have to be able to report down to less than 0.1% asbestos content. For vermiculite, they have to be able to report trace levels.
Just to touch on vermiculite really quick, Ed, there, because the next question is, does regulation define the number of samples required to verify contamination in vermiculite?
No, the regulation does not identify how many samples need to be collected. The guideline references the ASTM standard for bulk sample collection, and they basically reference 3, 5, or 7 samples depending on the type of material that's there and the quantity of the material. So that table that we referenced in section 1.3 of the guideline that lays out the sampling frequency, they tell you what should be sampled based on criteria that have been established by the ASTM method, and these are criteria that have been adopted by other regulatory bodies. So these are considered a measure of best practice, but the emphasis is on the sampling being done by a competent person, somebody who's capable of identifying what the material is, whether it's suspect, understanding the eras of construction, homogeneous, whether or not it's a homogeneous sample to the other materials in the area, the visual identification, all of that needs to be included in the assessment. So it's not straightforward in all cases. And the number of samples that they're referencing for the most part are considered minimum numbers of samples to rule out the presence of asbestos. If you get a positive hit, you have to assume at bare minimum the sample at the location where you collected the sample is asbestos containing. Collecting additional samples that come back as non-asbestos does not eliminate the need to treat the area where you collected the positive sample as being an asbestos containing material.
Perfect. Thanks, Ed. We have parging on the walls in many of our industrial buildings. Is it treated the same as drywall?
Parging as like a plaster or stucco coat? It's again, you have to look at the friability. You have to look at the content in it. You have to look at what you're doing at minimum, you are going to be looking at, if you're removing it, you're going to be looking at type 2 or type 3 precautions, depending on what you're doing for work. But again, it all boils down to, the reference goes back to, the sampling has to be done by a competent person. And if you're disturbing it, you have to develop safe work procedures based on a risk assessment. So you have to evaluate the material based on what's being done in that space. And if you're not sure about what the appropriate procedures are, that would be kind of a flag going, am I competent enough to develop those, do that risk assessment? If you're unsure of what procedures need to be followed, that's a good indication that maybe I don't have the experience and knowledge to make the right decision, and I should be looking to somebody with more knowledge on that topic. But personally, without seeing it and knowing what I'm looking at, I can't make that call over the phone or over a webinar. I would have to actually evaluate the material in person, because friability comes into play, condition comes into play, asbestos content comes into play. There's so many variables. And I know I sound like a consultant when I'm making that comment, but in all fairness, without seeing it, I've seen very, very soft parge coats. I've seen very, very hard cementitious parge coats, and I've seen hard cementitious products that, due to weathering and moisture exposure, have become soft, friable, and flaky. And the guideline is putting an emphasis on the risk assessment based on those criteria.
Fantastic. One more question about the roof here. If there is inaccessible vermiculite on the roof for clearance, is it acceptable to leave them as per the regulation?
It is going to depend on what's being undertaken. If you are removing the vermiculite to allow access for a renovation, like let's say we're doing an attic job and we're doing some electrical work or running some new duct work through the attic space in a residential application. If you've got a very shallow sloping roof, it is going to be very, very difficult to get at the soffits and areas at the very edges of the roof without doing demolition of your soffits on the outside of the building. So from a management standpoint, yes, you can leave that material in the attic space because it's not going to be impacted by the work that you are doing. But you are going to have to document that it's there, and you are going to have to manage it in place from a long-term management standpoint. Now, if the building is going to demolition, that completely changes the scenario, because the regulation states that prior to renovation, alteration, or demolition, any asbestos containing materials that are going to be subject to disturbance must be removed before that demolition can occur. And if it can't be removed, then the demolition must be undertaken while following the procedures required by parts 36 and 37 of the regulation. So if you can't get it and the demolition is going to potentially disturb that material, that means you have to implement asbestos precautions for the remaining demolition to address that material that stays behind.
Perfect. Good answer. I have about 8 more questions here, guys. So you've great questions coming in. So vermiculite insulation products in the form of fiber boards are common in hot manufacturing processes right now. Do these also fall under assumed to be contaminated by the asbestos rule? Not a building material, but machine insulative components.
That's a loaded question. It really is a loaded question, because historically, we know that The W.R. Grace mine is the only mine that we are aware of that had asbestos in the vermiculite deposits. They are still mining vermiculite in other countries like, or mica, and making vermiculite in other countries like South Africa. They are currently sampling the mica at those mines, testing it for asbestos as it comes out. And as far as we are aware of, all newly mined produced vermiculite is asbestos free. And that's why you can go to Home Depot, Rona, Lowe's, Canadian Tire, Walmart, go to the garden centers, go to the greenhouses, and you can buy vermiculite to mix into your potting soil today. So if you are talking brand new manufactured items that are using modern vermiculite, for lack of a better choice of words, the presumption is that is vermiculite that is asbestos free. Now, Libby shut down their mine in 1990 due to asbestos concerns. They processed the stockpiles for 2 years after they shut down the vermiculite, or after they shut down the mine, which means it probably took them several more years to sell off those stockpiles. So anything manufactured before the mid to late 90s is going to be suspect to have asbestos in it. The other caveat is other jurisdictions, other provinces like British Columbia and Alberta are taking a stricter stand, are leaning more strict, and they're saying because asbestos hasn't been found in any of the existing mica mines that are still operating, there's no guarantee that they may not hit a vein of asbestos in the future. And so some of the other regulatory jurisdictions are actually treating it as a suspect material, even the new stuff, regardless. So it all depends on where you are and what and how you're looking at it. So unfortunately, there's no black and white answers.
There used to be a form for periodic inspections and updates. Why did they delete this form?
Okay, that deletion I went over in the report. I can only speculate because they did not, when they made the revisions, there was no consultation with stakeholders. So the guidelines came out, they were revised. We can only speculate, but the speculation that I would guess, if I was a betting person, was there were probably too many people that were lacking competency taking that form, doing assessments, and it was more of a liability thing than anything.
Yeah.
Because stuff was getting missed. But that's speculation.
Yeah. Can you speak to the pre-renovation hazard materials assessment new guideline? Who can do this? What are they all looking for? Are samples required each time?
Okay. So the guideline that is being referenced here, I believe, is the new guideline that's out from Manitoba Conservation and Climate. It's been reviewed, it's been revised a few times since it's come out, and my understanding is there's going to be an additional revision to it in the near future, but we have not been advised as to when. What that guideline is doing is it's flagging, and the guideline is managing demolition waste with hazardous materials in it or something along that lines. I always forget the exact wording. It's kind of a long, wordy title to it. That guideline references multiple regulation sections. And what it states is, referencing Part 36 of the regulation, which is chemical biological substances, it says if you are doing a renovation or demolition of a building, you must conduct a hazardous materials assessment as a pre-renovation assessment before the work begins. And they cite a list of potential hazardous materials that you might encounter: asbestos, mercury, silica, lead, PCBs, arsenic are all some of the materials that have been identified. It falls back on the same definition that the asbestos regulations and guidelines follow. Must be done by a competent person. The regulation defines that as somebody with education, knowledge, and experience, but they do not tell you or give you any thorough, detailed information on what that entails. So the bottom line is, if you're not sure of what you need to be looking for, that's usually an indicator that you do not meet the requirements for a competent person. If you know what to look for, but you do not know how to assess the risk associated with it, again, that's an indicator that you probably do not have adequate level of competency to do that assessment. That guideline puts an emphasis on the three big ones: asbestos, lead, and PCBs as being minimum mandatories for that hazardous assessment. But the other one that really needs to be included is mercury, because there's a lot of mercury thermostats, and there's a lot of mercury gauges when we get into mechanical equipment that need to also be addressed. That guideline makes reference to the need for leachate testing prior to disposal of waste at the landfill. It flags the importance of sampling products like caulking for PCB content, something that gets widely ignored in our construction industry when it comes to renovation work. Puts a strong. The guideline flags up that the demolition waste guideline actually goes as far as saying you need to sample carpet adhesives for asbestos content. It flags up a lot of stuff that typically historically flew under the radar when it came to renovation work. So once we get a more concise final revised version on the guideline with final edits, we'll likely do a presentation on that guideline as well. But we haven't been jumping on that yet, because they've told us they're planning to do at least one more revision to that guideline before it's finalized.
And trust me, the more pokes we get, the more likely we are to do it sooner. So we appreciate that some of you asked us to kind of go through this today. So I had a request to post in the chat where this webinar will be posted. So in the chat feature, I have posted on the Pinchin website where this will be posted, probably in the next 2-3 days. And we've had a request for this 5-page cheat sheet that you've referenced. Do you think, would it be okay if I posted that with the webinar when it gets posted, like a PDF?
Yep, that's probably the easiest way to do it, because right now we have 61 participants online. That's a lot of emails to send out, and I wouldn't want to miss anybody.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Next question: is parging wall finish treated the same as drywall? I think you've already discussed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The concern on glove bagging is very disturbing. As we rely on contractors for asbestos abatement, what should be our biggest concern?
The biggest concern is you need the guideline puts the revisions to the guideline put a huge emphasis on risk evaluations being done by a competent person and the need to do regular air monitoring. And the air monitoring needs to be done by a competent person, and it needs to be analyzed at by an accredited lab or analyst. So when we look at the construction industry as a whole, when we're building a house, when we're building a garage, when we're doing a major renovation to a commercial building, we have to pull permits. And part of that permitting system is at certain stages of the construction, there's mandatory requirements to have your electrical, your plumbing, your stuff, your construction has to be inspected by a qualified inspector when you pull your permits. The regulation calls for notification of the province when you're doing any asbestos removal that has the potential to release asbestos into the atmosphere. And they define that under the guideline at minimum as type 2 and type 3 abatement. But there is no government regulated agency that does the inspection and air monitoring. The onus is on the building owner or the building employer to have it done by a competent person. So basically, what you want to be doing is, if you don't have the qualified staff that are trained and capable of doing inspection and air monitoring, which is 99.99% of the people out there, you need to be going to a competent outside resource that has trained and qualified people to do inspection and air monitoring on a regular or a more frequent basis. When we look at our liability insurance, as a consultant, I am not allowed to do asbestos abatement because that voids my liability insurance. As a contractor, you're not allowed to be doing, if you start doing your own consulting, you have the potential of voiding your liability insurance. You don't want the fox guarding the hen house. So you want to bring in an independent third party to do your inspection and air monitoring. At very minimum at a regular intervals during the work. It may not, depending on where you're located and the extent of the renovation, it might be daily inspections, it might be random intermittent inspections, spaced periodically throughout the course of the work if it's a long-term job and there isn't money in the budget to doing it. But money shouldn't be the sole deciding factor. You have to be looking at risk. Are they doing one elbow? Are they doing a month's worth of work? Are they doing 300 elbows within 2 weeks, or are they doing 12 elbows interspersed over 3 months? What's the risk associated with it? What's the potential? Are they working in an unoccupied building, or are they working next door to a daycare? All of these factors have to be evaluated in determining what frequency of inspection needs to be done, what are the potential exposure risks, and the inspection and air monitoring should be done by a competent person that knows how to evaluate not only how to set up a pump and run an air sample, but how to look and watch and go, did they actually set the glove bags up correctly? Have they isolated the area properly? Has the ventilation system been shut down in compliance with the procedures laid out in the guideline? Are they following proper procedures to remove the glove bags from the pipe? Or is everything being packaged and disposed of properly? All that stuff needs to be evaluated.
Interview your contractors and make sure they're they are following proper SOPs and using qualified labs.
But it goes beyond interviewing. It goes to actually having somebody capable monitor the work, because there's a lot of people out there that talk a great show, but they don't walk the walk.
That is true.
Because somebody talks a great show doesn't necessarily mean they do, they perform a great job. I've seen some people, you know, I've seen some guy that had all kinds of he had lots of credentials. He'd worked for various consulting firms. He'd taken tons of courses, been in the industry 30 years, shows up on a job site and he put his respirator on upside down. Talking great show.
Let's keep going here. We got a couple more questions. When referring to ACM and roofing, did the statements also apply to asphalt shingles?
Yes, they did put asbestos in asphalt shingles. If you go for a weekend drive in the country and you see some of these really old buildings kicking around on farmers' fields, you'll see a lot of you'll periodically see the odd old building kicking around with the asphalt siding that looks like fake red brick. All of that potentially had asbestos in it. But the thing with the old asphalt shingles is that whole 25 to 30 year life expectancy. Most of the old asphalt shingles that had asbestos in them have been replaced by now. But that doesn't mean you may not have a building where somebody put newer shingles over old shingles. So it's always be careful when you start doing the work.
And our last question here, unless more come in, is there any guideline for soil contaminated with asbestos in the commercial buildings, for example, crawl spaces, basements, etc.?
No, there are no formal guidelines for contaminated soil. When it comes to cleaning a crawl space with a soil crawl space, again, it boils down to visual inspection and assessment by a competent person. In the absence of completely excavating a crawl space, it's virtually impossible to guarantee you got all the asbestos. I've done inspections on abatement jobs, found a piece of mechanical insulation sticking out of the soil. You get the contractor to start cleaning, and next thing you know, they've got to dig down 3 feet to get that whole piece of asbestos out of the ground. It can be buried fairly deep in the soil sometimes. We have been involved in a few jobs where we've done extensive, almost forensic style soil sampling, air monitoring and testing, and we've confirmed that if you've done a thorough visual inspection and got all of the significant notable amount of asbestos debris from the soil, excuse me, you can get the soil clean enough that you can occupy the soil without any significant risk for maintenance and regular day-to-day activities within a crawl space. But if you're getting into a situation where you're doing some fairly significant excavation, you may need to reevaluate that.
Crawl spaces are kind of a hot button for Ed, and he's one of the people in our office that really helps us stay on top of new guidelines and crawl space regulations. And stay tuned. We are going to be having a webinar come out for our clients probably in the next month or so in regards to crawl spaces and the new hazardous material or hazards crawl space and stuff, labeling them properly, that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for that. My last question here, Ed, before we wrap up, is why does the province not provide presentations similar to this Pinchin presentation? They wrote it, they should know it. Why are they not sharing this information with everybody?
you would have to reach, I can't speak for them. There is Workplace Safety and Health is the enforcement branch. Safe Work Manitoba is the education branch, and you would have to reach out to them to find out why it is that they do it the way they do. I can't. They are completely independent of us, and I can't speak for them. I mean, that's the best I can answer that.
No, fair. Yeah. Probably some feedback. So let them know that you want to see presentations. We get that feedback all the time, guys, and that's why we kind of do these presentations. We think it's important that you know the information. We would really, really appreciate if you could scan the QR code on your screen, give us feedback, let us know if there's other presentations you'd like to see. I'm the one that pokes all the smart people in our office, try to crack their brain open and share it with you guys. In saying that, we really appreciate you joining us today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to myself. That web link is posted in the chat feature. So that's where it'll be posted as well with your top 5 takeaway cheat sheets. So in saying that, Ed, thank you so much for your presentation today, and we will hopefully see you all soon. Bye, guys.
Thank you to everyone that sat in on it.